999. 1,000.
Oh, how long you been on that thing for?
Coming up on 3,500 minutes.
Oh, hey, didn't see you there. Ben and Connor here working out. Let's start our TED Talk.
I know, you wanna go. You wanna go. I know, you wanna go.
I decided to analyze the novel The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien through a historical criticism lens. Historical criticism is when someone analyzes a piece of literature by comparing what happened to the book to what was happening around the time of the novel. It also includes how losers in history tend to keep their stories to themselves. Both of these greatly represent the things they carried and help showcase why O'Brien wrote the novel the way that he did.
I chose a critical source that focuses on the fact that losers of history tend to underplay the role of their adversary, a theme that is prevalent in the things they carry, but oftentimes overlooked. In the article, I Feel Close to Myself, Solipsism, and U.S. Imperialism in Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried by Michael Tavel Clark, the possible explanations as to why O'Brien focused much of the story on the American soldier in the inner battle as opposed to the American soldier versus the Vietnam soldier are uncovered. Clark says, like many Vietnam narratives, obsessed with the war's effect on the U.S., an obsession that reduces the Vietnamese to bit players. This means that the U.S. couldn't handle accepting defeat by the Vietnamese, and instead had to focus on how the war affected the U.S., not who affected the U.S. This immature tactic of repressing bad memories could very well be the reason why O'Brien didn't write his novel until the 90s, nearly 20 years after the war, because he knew that his novel wouldn't be well received when America's first lost wounds were so fresh, due to U.S. citizens' egocentric nature. Even still, O'Brien stays cautious throughout his novel, being careful to strictly focus on the American soldiers and their inner struggles, and briefly touches on the Vietnamese soldiers and culture. This creates a safe-feeling environment for the American reader, because throughout the whole book, the protagonist is the American soldier, the antagonist is the American soldier, and pretty much every aspect of the book revolves around America, and not the fact that the U.S. lost to Vietnam, which subconsciously softens the blow for the patriotic American reader.
I chose a critical source that focuses on why O'Brien wrote the novel in the manner he did. Just like Ben stated, the losers of history tend to keep their stories to themselves, as there is not much support able to be gained from losing. In the paper, A Lesser Imitation, How Redeployment Recalls, Expands, and Departs from the Things They Carried, written by Grace Howard, Howard goes on to say, although The Things They Carried predominantly features character narrator Tim O'Brien, he does not offer one overarching universal understanding of war. For instance, O'Brien's constant obsession with characteristics that comprise a true war story complicate the idea of a singular, universal understanding of war. This is evident throughout the novel because O'Brien continuously contradicts what he says the true making of a war story should entail, which makes sense since he was not a war supporter. On page 40, O'Brien said, "I was a liberal for Christ's sake. If they needed fresh bodies, why not draft some back to the Stone Age hawk?" O'Brien wrote the novel the way he did because he was not in favor of the war. He was terrified, understanding he had to go to war against his will, which caused his writing of what a war story has to be contradictory. He would say a true war story is one to never end, but then state how a war story cannot be indulged with abstraction or analysis. Not allowing an ending to a story forces the reader to make their own analysis. Much like how Americans didn't allow an end for the Vietnam War at all. It sort of just faded away and got swept under the rug of history. O'Brien tells a story of himself as a foot soldier in Vietnam and all the responsibilities and repercussions that came with fighting in the war. What he went through during Vietnam is what most of the soldiers who were drafted to the war went through as well. At just the age of most students in college, some as young as the students in this class, these soldiers went to one of the deadliest wars, knowing they'd be staring death in the eye every day. The innate fear of dying in war is something not only O'Brien was worried about, but the entirety of the young men serving had the same feeling. These overwhelming feelings of death caused many of those with the draft notice to escape to Canada in hopes of dodging the draft and war completely. In the novel, this is something that O'Brien considers himself, and he says on page 42, At some point in mid-July, I began thinking seriously about Canada.
The Vietnam War was one of the deadliest and most gruesome wars the U.S. fought in, furthering the overwhelming urge to flee to a different country. The young men who were drafted saw it as being sent to their deaths, due to how little everyone knew of this uncharted land, and how unprepared all of the draftees were, with many of them holding a gun for the first time when they went to training. Throughout the entire war, U.S. soldiers were at the disadvantage, having to live in the worst conditions possible. O'Brien recalls, he remembered how the water kept rising, how a terrible sting began to swell up out of the earth on page 161.
Finally, PTSD was a reoccurring problem with the veterans of Vietnam War. It was also an issue that was showcased towards the end of the novel. During that time, however, there is little to no information on what PTSD was, which is what made it so deadly after the war. These soldiers would come back from war feeling empty, alone, depressed, not being able to find happiness in anything they used to greatly enjoy before. It was as if they came back to a type of living that has never been experienced before. In the novel, it was easy to see that Norman Bakker fell victim to this horrific disorder that caused him to ultimately end his life. In a letter to O'Brien, Bakker explains the emotions he has been experiencing after returning from war. He says, "The thing is," he wrote, "there is no place to go. No, just not in this lousy little town. In general, my life, I mean. It's almost like I got killed over in Nam," on page 150. It is very sad to see those who served our country and made it out alive are still forced to fight another deadly battle within their head every day after returning back.
Throughout looking at The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, through a historical criticism lens, we are able to compare what happened in the book to what was happening during the novel's time period. We focus our analysis mainly on how losers historically tend to keep their failures to themselves, and how that could be recognized in O'Brien's novel, The Vietnam War, throughout the United States during that time period, and even today. We thank you for your time.